The atmosphere of the planet designated as Aurelia Prime did not scream with the violence of a re-entry burn, nor did it shudder with the turbulent protest of a dying craft. Instead, the vessel known as the Seeker of Horizons glided through the upper thermosphere with the grace of a needle-piercing silk. Inside the cockpit, the navigator, a man named Aris Thorne, watched the telemetry screens with a steady, unblinking gaze. He did not care for the frantic pace of the inner colonies or the rigid structures of the old planetary governance. His soul was calibrated for the quiet, the vast stretches of nothingness that lay between the stars, and the rare, breathless moments when that nothingness gave way to something new. The world below was a riot of color, a sphere of deep emeralds and soft, pulsing teals that seemed to breathe in a slow, rhythmic cycle. There were no sprawling metallic hives here, no scars of industrial ambition, only the raw, untamed beauty of a biosphere that had never known the touch of a sentient footfall. Aris adjusted the lateral thrusters, feeling the slight vibration through the floorboards of the ship, a sensation he found more comforting than the most luxurious of gravitational beds. Beside him, the lead biologist, Elara Vance, was silent, her fingers dancing over the sensor arrays to capture every scrap of data the descent provided. They had been traveling for months in the quiet dark, and the sudden influx of sensory information, the chemical composition of the air, the electromagnetic hum of the planet's core, the refraction of light through the unique particulate matter of the troposphere, was like water to a parched traveler. The descent took hours, a deliberate and methodical approach designed to minimize the impact on the local environment. They were not here to conquer or to claim. They were here to observe, to understand, and to find peace in the discovery of the unknown. As the ship dipped below the cloud layer, a thick blanket of iridescent vapor that tasted of ozone and nectar, the true scale of the landscape revealed itself. Massive, floating islands of vegetation drifted lazily in the dense lower atmosphere, tethered to the ground by thick, vine-like structures that pulsed with internal bioluminescence. Below these islands lay a world of soft rolling hills covered in a moss-like substance that shifted color as the wind passed over it, moving from a pale gold to a vibrant violet. There were no jagged peaks or harsh deserts in sight, only a continuous flowing topography that felt intentional, as if the planet itself were a work of art in progress. The Seeker of Horizons deployed its landing struts, which were tipped with wide, weight-distributing pads to avoid crushing the delicate flora. The landing was nearly silent, a soft hiss of compressed air being the only sound to mark their arrival on this virgin world. Aris shut down the primary engines, allowing the ship systems to transition to a low-power standby mode. The sudden absence of the engine's hum left a void that was quickly filled by the ambient sounds of Aurelia Prime. It was not a silence, but a tapestry of noise, the distant chime of wind through hollow reeds, the soft rustle of the golden moss, and the rhythmic thrum of the floating islands above. They spent the first day within the confines of the ship, performing the necessary atmospheric checks and ensuring that no terrestrial microbes would contaminate the biosphere. It was a tedious process, but one born of a deep respect for the sanctity of life in all its forms. Aris spent the time cleaning the viewports, wanting an unobstructed look at the world they had traveled so far to reach. He watched as the sun, a gentle yellow star that cast long, amber shadows, dipped toward the horizon. The transition to night was not a descent into darkness, but a transformation into a different kind of light. The bioluminescence of the flora intensified, turning the landscape into a shimmering sea of neon blues and soft pinks. It was a sight that defied the cynical expectations of the modern age, a reminder that the universe still held secrets that were beautiful simply for the sake of being beautiful. Elara eventually joined him at the window, her face illuminated by the glow of the planet. She spoke of the nitrogen-oxygen balance, the surprising lack of heavy metals in the soil, and the potential for a symbiotic relationship between every living thing on the surface. She did not use the language of exploitation, but the language of a guest entering a grand home. They shared a meal of reconstituted grains and dried fruits, the simplicity of the food matching the understated majesty of their surroundings. There was no rush to step outside, no desperate need to plant a flag. The planet wasn't going anywhere, and for the first time in his life, Aris felt like he wasn't going anywhere either. He was exactly where he was meant to be. When the second morning arrived, the airlock cycled open with a rhythmic mechanical sigh, and the two explorers stepped onto the surface. The air was cool and carried the scent of crushed mint and damp earth. Aris took a deep breath, feeling the purity of it fill his lungs, a stark contrast to the recycled, sterile air of the ship. The ground beneath his boots was springy, giving slightly with every step and then reclaiming its shape. He looked down to see that the violet moss was already beginning to weave itself around the edges of his footprints, as if trying to heal the minor disturbance. He walked slowly, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning the horizon not for threats, but for details. He noticed the way the light caught the translucent leaves of the nearby shrubbery, making them look like shards of stained glass. He saw the small, multi-legged creatures that skittered between the roots, their carapaces gleaming with a pearlescent sheen. They showed no fear of the giants in their midst, only a mild, clicking curiosity. Aris reached out a gloved hand to touch a hanging vine, and it responded by curling gently around his fingers, a soft warmth radiating from its core. It was a tactile conversation, a physical acknowledgement of his presence. He felt a profound sense of calm wash over him, a shedding of the anxieties and stresses that the vastness of space usually instilled. Here, the scale was manageable, the beauty was tangible, and the purpose was clear. As they moved further from the landing site, the terrain began to rise into a series of gentle terraces. Each level of the terrace held a different ecosystem, a microenvironment with its own unique colors and textures. On the first level, they found pools of liquid that were not water, but a dense, crystalline fluid that reflected the sky with perfect clarity. Small, floating orbs of light drifted above the pools, occasionally dipping down to touch the surface and send ripples of color outward. Elara knelt by one of the pools, her senses humming as they analyzed the liquid. She discovered it was rich in organic polymers, a sort of primordial soup that was both stable and life-sustaining. She didn't take a sample, she simply recorded the data and moved on. The goal was to leave the world exactly as they found it. Aris climbed to the top of the next terrace and looked back. The Seeker of Horizons looked like a small silver toy against the backdrop of the Emerald Forest. It was a reminder of their origins, a piece of high technology in a world that had no need for it. He felt a strange disconnect from the ship, a feeling that it belonged to a different version of himself, one that was always looking for the next waypoint, the next jump. Here, the journey was the destination. He sat down on a smooth, weathered stone that felt like velvet under his touch and watched the clouds move. They didn't drift so much as they danced, swirling in intricate patterns that seemed to follow the unseen currents of the planet's magnetic field. The afternoon was spent in a state of quiet reverie. They followed a narrow path that wound between groves of tall, slender trees with bark that looked like braided copper. The leaves were long and ribbon-like, swaying in a breeze that Aris couldn't feel, as if they were reacting to a different frequency of existence. He found himself lost in the repetition of the environment, the way the patterns of the trees and the moss created a visual rhythm that slowed his heart rate and cleared his mind. He thought about the billions of people living on the crowded worlds of the core, the noise, the heat, the constant demand for attention and productivity. He wished he could bottle the essence of this place and send it back, not as a resource to be harvested, but as a reminder of what it meant to simply be. Elara caught up to him, her pack filled with digital readings and holographic captures. She looked younger than she had when they left the station, the lines of worry around her eyes smoothed away by the ambient peace of Aurelia Prime. She pointed toward a distant shimmering curtain of light that seemed to fall from the sky. It was a waterfall, but instead of water, it appeared to be a cascade of glowing particles, a literal river of light flowing from one of the floating islands down into a deep, hidden basin. They began to walk toward it, drawn by the ethereal beauty of the phenomenon. Every step revealed a new wonder: flowers that opened with a soft melodic pop, insects that trailed ribbons of light behind them, and the ever-present sense that the planet was watching them with a benevolent, quiet curiosity. By the time they reached the basin, the sun was beginning to set again. The river of light was even more spectacular up close, a roaring torrent of brilliance that didn't generate heat, but a soft, tingly sensation in the air. Aris stood at the edge of the basin, the light reflecting off his visor and painting his suit in 1,000 shades of gold. He felt small, but not insignificant. He felt like a witness to a miracle that happened every day, a part of a cycle that had continued for eons and would continue long after he was gone. He realized then that the greatest discovery wasn't a new mineral or a revolutionary biological compound. It was the realization that the universe was capable of such profound tranquility. They set up a small, temporary shelter near the basin, a simple dome of transparent polymer that allowed them to keep watching the river of light throughout the night. They didn't speak much. The environment did the talking for them. As Aris lay down to sleep, he listened to the low-frequency thrum of the planet, a sound that felt like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, his dreams were not of cold steel and flickering monitors, but of emerald forests and rivers of light. He was no longer a traveler in search of a home. He had found a place where the concept of home felt redundant. He was simply a part of the world, a single thread in the vast, glowing tapestry of Aurelia Prime, and that was more than enough. The following morning, the light from the waterfall seemed to have infused the entire valley with a soft, persistent radiance. Aris woke feeling more rested than he had in years, the usual stiffness of low-gravity travel replaced by a strange, buoyant energy. He stepped out of the shelter and found Elara already awake, sitting cross-legged on the ground and watching a group of small, translucent creatures gather near the edge of the light pool. They looked like miniature deer, but with long, prehensile tails and skin that shifted between amber and indigo. They were drinking the light, or perhaps absorbing the energy from it, their bodies glowing brighter with every moment. They didn't flee when Aris approached. One of them even walked up to him and nudged his hand with a snout that felt like cool silk. He stayed still, allowing the creature to investigate him. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection, a bridge built between two entirely different evolutionary paths without the need for words or tools. He felt a deep sense of responsibility in that moment, a vow to keep this place a secret, to protect it from the hungry eyes of the galaxy. This was not a resource, it was a sanctuary. He spent the rest of the morning sketching the creatures in a physical notebook he had brought, preferring the scratch of graphite on paper to the sterile precision of a digital tablet. The act of drawing forced him to look closer, to notice the intricate patterns of the creature's skin and the way their eyes reflected the surrounding forest. As they began their trek back toward the Seeker of Horizons, the landscape seemed to change, as if acknowledging their departure. The violet moss turned a deep, somber blue, and the wind picked up, carrying a low, morning tone through the copper trees. Aris felt a pang of sadness at the thought of leaving, but he knew that their presence here had to be fleeting. To stay too long would be to change the very thing they loved. He took one last look at the river of light, now a pale shimmer in the morning sun, and committed the sight to memory. He knew he would return to this image in the quiet moments of his life, a mental anchor to keep him steady in the storms of the future. The walk back was easier, their bodies now accustomed to the rhythm of the planet. They moved with a new kind of grace, a fluidity that came from being in tune with their surroundings. When they finally reached the ship, it looked different, less like a prison of technology and more like a sturdy companion that had brought them to the threshold of wonder. Aris began the pre-flight checks, his hands moving over the controls with practiced ease, but his mind remained outside, among the floating islands and the glowing pools. He engaged the atmospheric thrusters, and the ship lifted gently from the surface, leaving nothing behind but a slight indentation in the moss that would be gone within the hour. As they ascended, the emerald forests of Aurelia Prime blurred into a sea of color, and then into a sphere of pulsing teal against the blackness of space. Aris set the course for the next star system, but he didn't feel the usual restlessness. He had seen the heart of the universe, and it was green, and it was peaceful, and it was waiting. The transition from the vibrant atmosphere of Aurelia Prime back into the sterile, pressurized environment of the Seeker of Horizons felt like stepping from a warm bath into a chilled corridor. Aris Thorne sat in the pilot's chair, his hands resting lightly on the hilt of the manual override, though the automated ascent protocols were handling the climb with mathematical grace. He watched the emerald horizon curve until it became a brilliant crescent against the deep velvet of the void. There was no rush to engage the fold drive. The mission parameters allowed for a period of orbital observation to ensure the ship's hull had shed any lingering particulate matter from the biosphere. Elara Vance was already stationed at the aft sensor suite, her silhouette framed by the glow of the primary star. She wasn't looking at the data readouts yet. She was simply staring at the world they were leaving behind. The silence between them was not the heavy, awkward quiet of two people with nothing to say, but the resonant stillness of two people who had seen something that transcended language. Aris reached out and toggled the external cameras, bringing a high-resolution feed of the northern polar region onto the main screen. Instead of ice, the poles were capped in a shimmering, translucent crystalline structure that resembled a massive, frozen geode. The light from the sun caught the edges of these formations, scattering rainbows across the upper atmosphere like a prism. As the ship reached a stable high orbit, Aris began the long-range scans of the neighboring planet in the system, a terrestrial world designated as Solara Secundus. While Aurelia Prime was a garden of bioluminescence and soft moisture, Solara Secundus was a world of heat and mineral wealth, dominated by vast deserts of orange sand and towering mesas of solid amber. The distance between the two worlds was relatively short in astronomical terms, yet they represented two entirely different expressions of planetary evolution. Aris adjusted the orientation of the ship, pointing the nose toward the copper-colored orb that hung like a rusted coin in the distance. He felt a strange pull toward this second world, a curiosity that was less about biological wonder and more about the raw, geological history of the system. He engaged the ion thrusters, a soft blue luminescence trailing behind them as they began the transit. The journey would take 3 days at their current cruising speed, a deliberate pace that allowed them to process the sights of the first world before immersing themselves in the next. During the transit, Aris spent his time in the hydroponics bay, tending to the small garden of terrestrial herbs he kept there. He found the smell of rosemary and thyme to be a grounding influence, a tether to his own species' history amidst the alien grandeur. By the second day of the transit, the amber world began to grow in the viewports, revealing a surface etched with deep canyons and winding dry riverbeds that looked like the veins of a giant leaf. There was no liquid water visible from orbit, but the atmosphere was thick with a hazy golden dust that caught the sunlight and gave the planet a permanent, internal glow. Elara joined him on the flight deck, carrying a tray of synthesized tea. She sat in the co-pilot's chair and began to overlay the geological scans onto the visual feed. She pointed out the massive outcroppings of amber, some of which rose kilometers into the sky like jagged teeth. These were not the resinous sap of ancient trees, but a unique mineral composite, a fossilized organic sludge that had been pressurized over billions of years into a substance as hard as diamond and as clear as honey. The data suggested that the planet's core was still highly active, creating massive thermal vents that pumped heat into the lower atmosphere, driving a constant, gentle wind that polished the amber towers into smooth, flowing shapes. It was a world of stone and heat, yet it possessed a geometric beauty that was just as compelling as the forests they had left behind. The approach to Solara Secundus was more challenging than the descent into Aurelia Prime. The golden dust in the atmosphere created significant static interference, and the thermal updrafts from the mesas required Aris to take full manual control of the descent. He felt the ship buck and sway as it hit the first layer of the heated thermosphere, the metal hull groaning softly under the pressure. He didn't feel fear. He felt a heightened sense of awareness, a synchronization between his nervous system and the ship's flight surfaces. He guided the Seeker of Horizons toward a wide, flat plateau nestled between three of the tallest amber towers. The landing site was chosen for its stability and its proximity to a series of deep fissures that led into the planet's crust. As the landing struts touched down, a cloud of fine, ochre dust billowed up around the ship, obscuring the viewports for several minutes. When the dust finally settled, Aris found himself staring into a forest of glass. The amber towers surrounded them, their surfaces reflecting the ship's lights in a dazzling array of internal fractures and inclusions. It was like being inside a giant, golden jewelry box. They waited for the exterior temperature to stabilize before opening the hatch. The heat outside was significant, nearly 40 degrees Celsius, but the air was incredibly dry, making it feel more like a warm embrace than a stifling weight. Aris stepped out onto the plateau, his boots crunching on a surface of fine, crystalline sand. The wind was a constant, low whistle as it moved through the gaps in the amber towers, creating a natural flute-like music that echoed across the landscape. He walked toward the nearest tower, a massive pillar that stood nearly 500 meters tall. Up close, the amber was not a uniform color. It was a swirling tapestry of oranges, yellows, and deep burnt reds. He could see things trapped deep within the mineral, strange, spiraling fossils and bubbles of ancient atmosphere that had been preserved for an eternity. He pressed his hand against the surface and found it surprisingly warm, vibrating slightly with the geothermal energy flowing up from the depths. It felt alive, in a slow, tectonic way that made the human lifespan seem like the blink of an eye. Elara moved toward the edge of the plateau, where a series of natural stairs had been carved into the rock by eons of wind erosion. She was looking for signs of extremophile life, organisms that could thrive in the intense heat and mineral-rich environment. She found them in the cracks of the amber, tiny, translucent lichen-like growths that pulsed with a faint, internal heat. They didn't photosynthesize, they drew their energy directly from the thermal radiation of the planet. She spent hours documenting the structures, her movements slow and rhythmic, to match the pace of the world. Aris, meanwhile, climbed a small rise to get a better view of the horizon. From his vantage point, he could see for hundreds of kilometers. The desert stretched out in every direction, a sea of golden dunes punctuated by the vertical lines of the amber towers. Far to the south, a massive dust storm was moving slowly across the plains, looking like a curtain of liquid gold being drawn across the sky. There was a profound sense of solitude here, a feeling of being at the very edge of the universe, where the laws of biology gave way to the laws of geology. As the sun began to set, the character of the planet shifted once again. The golden haze of the atmosphere intensified the light, turning the entire sky into a brilliant, flaming orange. The amber towers began to glow from within, acting as massive lanterns that illuminated the plateau with a soft, diffused radiance. Aris and Elara sat at the edge of the ship's ramp, watching the shadows lengthen across the dunes. The heat began to dissipate, replaced by a cool, steady breeze that smelled of toasted earth and sharp minerals. They didn't need to speak to acknowledge the beauty of the moment. The silence of Solara Secundus was different from the silence of Aurelia Prime. It was a heavy, ancient silence, the silence of a tomb that was also a treasure chest. Aris thought about the path that had led him here, the years of training, the sacrifices made to reach the stars. He realized that he wasn't looking for a new world to live in, but for a new way to see. Every planet they visited was a different lens through which to view the majesty of existence. The next morning, they prepared to explore the deep fissures they had spotted from orbit. These canyons were narrow and deep, their walls made of translucent amber that allowed the sunlight to filter down even to the darkest depths. As they descended into the first canyon, the temperature dropped significantly, and the sound of the wind died away, replaced by a profound, ringing stillness. The floor of the canyon was covered in a layer of soft, white dust that looked like powdered sugar. Aris noticed that their voices sounded different here, richer and more resonant, as if the amber walls were acting as a natural acoustic chamber. They walked for miles, following the winding path of the canyon as it delved deeper into the planet's crust. Every turn revealed a new geological wonder. Veins of pure silver running through the amber, massive geodes filled with purple quartz, and strange, wind-sculpted formations that looked like frozen waves. At the heart of the canyon system, they found a massive chamber where several fissures converged. In the center of the chamber stood a single, perfectly spherical boulder of amber, suspended in midair by a powerful magnetic anomaly. The boulder was rotating slowly, its surface polished to a mirror finish. Around it, the walls of the chamber were covered in intricate, naturally occurring geometric patterns that looked almost like a written language. Aris stood in awe of the sight, the sheer improbability of such a structure forming through natural processes. It felt like a temple built by the planet itself, a monument to the forces of heat, pressure, and time. He reached out to touch the air near the floating boulder, feeling the tingle of the magnetic field against his skin. It was a reminder that the universe was not just a collection of matter, but a complex web of energy and influence. They spent the rest of the day in the chamber, conducting non-invasive scans and soaking in the atmosphere of the place. Elara discovered that the magnetic anomaly was caused by a unique concentration of metallic ores in the crust beneath the chamber, which interacted with the planet's core to create a localized field. It was a rare but entirely natural phenomenon. As they finally began the long climb back to the surface, Aris felt a sense of completion. He had seen the soft, breathing heart of one world and the hard, glowing ribs of another. He knew that their journey was far from over, but he felt a new sense of peace within himself. The Seeker of Horizons was waiting for them on the plateau, its silver hull reflecting the golden light of the amber towers. As they boarded the ship and prepared for the next leg of their journey, Aris took one last look at the desert. The dust storm from the previous day had passed, leaving the air clear and the dunes perfectly smooth. He engaged the engines, and the ship lifted into the golden sky, leaving the amber world behind to continue its slow, silent dance around its star. The departure from Solara Secundus was a gradual peeling away of gold and ochre as the Seeker of Horizons climbed out of the gravitational well and returned to the velvet embrace of deep space. Aris Thorne felt the familiar settling of his internal compass as the stars transitioned from blurred streaks back into sharp, unblinking points of light. The amber world had been a study in stillness and geological weight, leaving a lingering warmth in his mind that contrasted with the cold vacuum outside the hull. He spent the first few hours of the transit recalibrating the long-range navigational sensors, seeking the third jewel in this celestial crown. The star system they were traversing was unique, a rare configuration of habitable zones that seemed to foster diversity in every direction. The next destination, a world designated as Thalassa Minor, promised something entirely different, a planet dominated by a vast, global ocean punctuated only by a series of wandering, crystalline islands. According to the preliminary probes, the planet possessed a thick, high-pressure atmosphere that was saturated with water vapor, creating a permanent state of soft, diffuse illumination. There were no continents here, no mountains to climb, only the endless rhythm of the tides and the secrets hidden beneath the waves. Elara Vance spent the transit period in the ship's laboratory, her eyes fixed on the holographic projections of the amber fossils they had recorded. She was searching for a common thread, a biological or chemical signature that might link the vibrant life of Aurelia Prime with the slow mineral pulse of Solara Secundus. She found herself mesmerized by the geometric patterns of the amber lichen, noting how their structure mirrored the crystalline growth of the desert sands. Aris occasionally checked in on her, bringing fresh water and sharing quiet observations about the ship's performance. They had moved beyond the need for constant updates or mission briefings. Their partnership had become a shared meditation, a silent agreement to let the universe reveal itself at its own pace. As Thalassa Minor grew in the forward viewports, it appeared not as a blue marble, but as a shimmering, iridescent pearl. The thick clouds of the upper atmosphere reflected the light of the distant sun in shades of opal and mother-of-pearl, hiding the liquid surface beneath a veil of constant, glowing mist. The descent into Thalassa Minor required a different set of skills. The atmosphere was dense, acting more like a fluid than a gas, which meant the Seeker of Horizons had to be piloted like a submarine as much as a spacecraft. Aris adjusted the aerodynamic vanes, feeling the ship sink into the heavy, humid air. The temperature was moderate, kept stable by the massive heat capacity of the global ocean, but the pressure was significant, necessitating the activation of the internal structural reinforcements. As they broke through the final layer of clouds, the world opened up into a breathtaking expanse of silver water. The ocean was not turbulent. The high atmospheric pressure seemed to flatten the waves into long, rolling swells that moved with a slow, hypnotic grace. There was no horizon in the traditional sense, as the mist blurred the line where the water met the sky, creating the sensation of being inside a vast, translucent sphere. Scattered across the surface were the crystalline islands, clusters of translucent structures that looked like giant white corals reaching up from the depths. Aris chose a landing site on one of the larger archipelagos, a cluster of 5 islands connected by submerged reefs. The islands were made of a substance that was neither rock nor ice, but a complex, organic silicate that grew in hexagonal columns. The ship's landing pads settled onto the surface with a soft, wet squelch as the organic silicate compressed under the weight. When the engines finally cut out, The sound that filled the cabin was unlike anything Aris had ever heard. It was a deep, resonant humming, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to come from the water itself. It wasn't a mechanical sound, but a biological one, a collective song produced by the movement of the tides through the porous structures of the islands. Elara checked the external sensors and confirmed that the air was breathable, though thick with moisture and the scent of salt and ancient minerals. They donned their light environmental suits, designed more for protection against the pressure and humidity than for life support, and stepped out onto the surface of the archipelago. The ground was soft and slightly warm, covered in a thin film of bioluminescent algae that glowed a soft turquoise with every footstep. Aris walked to the edge of the island, where the silver water lapped gently against the white columns. He looked down into the depths and saw that the island did not simply sit on the water. It descended for hundreds of meters, a complex lattice of crystalline branches that served as a habitat for countless aquatic organisms. He saw schools of ribbon-like fish that moved in perfect unison, their bodies transparent except for a single glowing stripe along their sides. They didn't swim so much as they danced, their movements dictated by the rhythmic humming of the archipelago. He sat on the edge of a column, letting his legs hang over the water. He felt a sense of profound immersion, as if he were a part of the ocean's breath. The moisture in the air felt like a second skin, a reminder that life on this world was inseparable from the water that defined it. Elara moved toward the center of the island, where a large, bowl-shaped depression had formed in the silicate. The depression was filled with a shallow pool of water that was perfectly still, acting as a natural mirror for the opalescent sky. In the center of the pool grew a single, towering structure that resembled a glass willow tree. Its branches were long and flexible, draped with glowing filaments that dipped into the water. These filaments acted as sensors, detecting the chemical changes in the ocean and translating them into the low-frequency hum that permeated the atmosphere. Elara spent hours observing the willow, noting how the light in its branches changed color as the tide came in. It was a biological clock, a living instrument that kept the rhythm of the world. She didn't need to take samples to understand its function. She could feel the pulse of the tree in the ground beneath her feet. It was an anchor, a focal point for the life that swarmed around the archipelago. As the day progressed, the light on Thalassa Minor remained constant, a soft, shadowless glow that made it difficult to track the passage of time. Aris and Elara explored the interconnected islands, crossing the submerged reefs where the water was only ankle-deep. They found small tide pools filled with intricate, jewel-like crustaceans that spent their lives polishing the silicate columns. There was a sense of industry here, but it was not the frantic industry of survival. It was a slow, methodical maintenance of the home they inhabited. Aris found a smooth, flat area of the island and lay down, looking up at the swirling mist. He thought about the concept of time on a world like this, where there were no seasons, no days and nights in the traditional sense, only the endless rise and fall of the tide. It was a world of eternal present, a place where the past and the future were dissolved in the silver water. He felt his own sense of urgency fading away, replaced by a deep, oceanic calm. In the afternoon, the humming of the islands grew louder, shifting from a low drone to a rich, multi-tonal chord. The water around the archipelago began to churn as a massive migration of aquatic life commenced. Thousands of the ribbonfish rose to the surface, accompanied by larger, more majestic creatures that looked like floating mantas made of liquid light. They gathered around the archipelago, their movements synchronized with the music of the silicate columns. It was a communal event, a gathering of the world's inhabitants to celebrate the peak of the tidal cycle. Aris stood at the edge of the water, watching the display with a sense of awe that felt like a physical weight in his chest. He realized that the planet was not just a collection of islands and water. It was a single, living organism, a resonant system where every part played a role in the harmony of the whole. The manta creatures breached the surface in slow, graceful arcs, their bodies spraying diamonds of water into the misty air. As the tidal peak passed and the humming subsided back into a gentle drone, the aquatic life dispersed back into the depths, leaving the archipelago in a state of quiet reflection. Aris and Elara returned to the Seeker of Horizons, their suits damp and their minds filled with the music of the ocean. They sat in the small galley, drinking warm broth and watching the silver swells through the main viewport. They didn't feel the need to document everything they had seen. Some experiences were meant to be lived, not recorded. Aris thought about the 3 worlds they had visited, the green forests of Aurelia Prime, the golden towers of Solara Secundus, and now the silver waters of Thalassa Minor. Each was a masterpiece of existence, a testament to the infinite creativity of the universe. He felt a sense of gratitude for the opportunity to be a witness to such beauty, to be a small, temporary part of these grand, ancient cycles. The final morning on Thalassa Minor was spent in a state of quiet preparation. Aris performed the engine checks with a sense of reverence, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't want to disturb the peace of the archipelago with the violence of a departure, but he knew that they had to move on. There were more worlds to see, more songs to hear. He engaged the buoyancy compensators, and the ship lifted slowly from the silicate surface, the water dripping from the landing pads in long, shimmering ribbons. As they ascended through the thick clouds, the silver ocean vanished beneath the veil of mist, leaving only the memory of the humming islands. Aris set the course for the outer edge of the system, toward a world that promised a different kind of discovery. He looked at Elara, who was already at her station, her face calm and her eyes bright. They were no longer just explorers. They were part of the story of the stars, a story that was being written one world at a time. The Seeker of Horizons moved forward into the dark, carrying the light of 3 worlds within its hull, and Aris Thorne felt a sense of peace that he knew would never leave him. The departure from the liquid embrace of Thalassa Minor marked the final leg of their journey toward the furthest reaches of the system. The Seeker of Horizons ascended through the opalescent mists, the hull vibrating with a low, rhythmic frequency that seemed to echo the humming of the islands they left behind. Aris Thorne watched as the pearl-like world shrank into a distant spark, his thoughts lingering on the weight of the water and the slow grace of the manta creatures. The ship was now heading toward a celestial anomaly designated as the Weaver's Wake, a localized nebula trapped within the gravitational pocket of a dormant gas giant. Unlike the solid surfaces of the previous worlds, the Wake was a realm of ethereal gases and suspended crystalline dust, a place where the line between planet and space was blurred into a continuous tapestry of light and shadow. The transit was quiet, the ship systems operating at peak efficiency as they drifted through the thinning tail of the system's primary radiation belt. Aris spent the time in the observation lounge, a circular room with transparent flooring that gave the illusion of floating directly in the void. He found himself contemplating the nature of connection, how the green pulse of Aurelia Prime, the amber heat of Solara Secundus, and the silver resonance of Thalassa Minor were all threads in a single cosmic design. Elara Vance was occupied with the structural analysis of the dust samples they had skimmed from the upper atmosphere of the ocean world. She discovered that the organic silicates were not merely dormant minerals, but acted as a slow-processing memory storage for the planet's tidal history. It was a revelation that changed her perspective on the very ground they had walked upon. The islands were living libraries, recording the passage of eons in their hexagonal columns. She shared this with Aris over a meal of sun-dried tubers and a crisp, fermented juice they had brought from the core worlds. They spoke of the responsibility of knowledge, the burden of carrying these stories back to a civilization that often measured value in terms of consumption and expansion. They agreed that their mission was not one of reporting, but of preservation through witness. As the Weaver's Wake came into view, the conversation died away, replaced by the sheer visual magnitude of the nebula. It was a vast, swirling cloud of deep indigo and pale lavender, shot through with veins of brilliant white light that looked like lightning frozen in time. The approach to the nebula required Aris to engage the ship's magnetic shielding to its maximum capacity. The wake was highly ionized, a sea of charged particles that danced in complex patterns around the gravity of the dark gas giant at its center. This giant, a world of deep charcoal clouds and silent storms, provided the anchor for the nebula's delicate structure. As the Seeker of Horizons entered the outer tendrils of the gas cloud, the viewports were filled with a soft, persistent glow. It was like flying through a dream, the ship's path illuminated by the natural fluorescence of the nebula. There was no landing here, no solid ground to claim. Instead, they would deploy the ship's tethered observation pods, allowing them to drift within the currents of the wake while remaining linked to the primary life support systems of the vessel. Aris stabilized the ship's position in a pocket of relatively calm gas, a hollow within the nebula that resembled a vast, vaulted cathedral of purple smoke. When they entered the observation pods and detached from the main docking ring, the sensation of weightlessness was absolute. The pods were spheres of reinforced glass, providing a 360-degree view of the environment. Aris felt as though he had been stripped of his physical form and cast into a sea of pure energy. Around him, the crystalline dust of the nebula began to react to the presence of the pod's magnetic field, swirling into intricate, spiraling shapes that looked like the blueprints of galaxies. These were the weavings, for which the anomaly was named, natural formations of dust and gas that moved with a slow, deliberate intentionality. He watched as a ribbon of white light drifted past his pod, its edges fraying into 1,000 tiny filaments that pulsed in time with the ship's own reactor hum. It was a physical manifestation of harmony, a place where the fundamental forces of the universe were visible to the naked eye. Elara's pod was positioned a few hundred meters away, and through the comms, he could hear her soft intake of breath as she observed the microscopic life forms that inhabited the gas clouds. They were not creatures of flesh and bone, but entities of pure plasma and structured light. They looked like delicate, shimmering threads that wove themselves in and out of the dust ribbons, acting as catalysts for the nebula's luminosity. She called them the Loom Keepers, for they seemed to be the ones maintaining the integrity of the gas clouds, preventing them from dissipating into the void. They moved with a collective intelligence, a hive mind that operated on the scale of light years. Aris watched a cluster of these entities gather near his pod, their light shifting from a cool blue to a warm, welcoming gold. He felt a strange, telepathic echo, not of words, but of a profound sense of welcome. The nebula was not a hostile environment. It was a nursery, a place where the building blocks of future star systems were being carefully tended. The hours they spent drifting in the wake were the most peaceful of Aris's life. Without the distraction of gravity or the horizon, his mind expanded to fill the space around him. He thought of his ancestors, who had looked up at the stars from the mud of a single planet and wondered if they were alone. He wished he could tell them that the universe was more alive than they could have ever imagined, though perhaps not in the way they had expected. Life was not just a biological accident. It was a fundamental property of matter, a drive toward complexity and beauty that manifested in every corner of the cosmos. He watched a massive wave of lavender gas roll through the cathedral space, carrying with it a cargo of glowing crystals that settled like stars onto the surface of his pod. He reached out, his hand pressing against the glass, and for a moment he felt the vibration of the nebula's song, a deep subsonic thrum that resonated in his very marrow. As the shadow of the gas giant began to eclipse the nebula's internal light, the wake underwent a startling transformation. The indigo and lavender faded into a deep, velvety black, but the veins of white light intensified, becoming brilliant conduits of energy that connected the various parts of the cloud. It looked like a giant neural network, a brain the size of a solar system contemplating the mysteries of time. Aris and Elara remained in their pods, watching the silent fireworks of the ionized gases as they reacted to the shifting magnetic fields. There was no sound in the vacuum, but the visual rhythm was so potent that Aris could almost hear the crackle of the energy ribbons. He felt a deep sense of humility, a realization that his own life was but a single spark in this vast, eternal furnace. Yet that spark was part of the whole, a necessary component of the universe's self-awareness. The next morning, if the term could be applied to such a place, they retracted the pods and re-entered the Seeker of Horizons. The ship felt small and fragile after the expanse of the nebula, a tin can protecting them from the infinite. But it was also a sanctuary, a place where they could process the overwhelming input of the wake. They spent the day in silence, each lost in their own reflections. Aris cleaned the sensors, his movements mechanical and soothing, while Elara began the painstaking process of cataloging the plasma entities. They didn't need to discuss what they had seen. The experience had woven itself into their friendship, creating a bond that was stronger than any shared history. They were the only two humans in existence who knew the secret of the loom, and that knowledge was a treasure they would guard with their lives. As they prepared to leave the Weaver's wake and head toward the final destination of their journey, a moon on the very edge of the system's influence, Aris took one last look at the nebula through the aft viewport. It was still there, a swirling tapestry of light and shadow, continuing its work of creation regardless of who was watching. He felt a sense of closure, a feeling that he had finally understood the purpose of their exploration. They were not there to find answers, but to ask better questions. They were there to learn how to be better guests in a universe that was far older and wiser than they were. He engaged the primary thrusters, the blue flame of the engines cutting a path through the indigo clouds, and the Seeker of Horizons moved forward once more, heading toward the cold, quiet frontier where the light of the stars finally began to fade. The departure from the Weaver's wake felt like waking from a dream of infinite color into a reality of stark, crystalline clarity. As the Seeker of Horizons pushed toward the outermost reaches of the system, the vibrant indigo of the nebula faded into the true, deep black of the interstellar medium. Their destination was a moon named Eos, a lonely sentinel orbiting a frozen gas giant that marked the very edge of the star's gravitational grip. Unlike the lush forests of Aurelia Prime or the resonant oceans of Thalassa Minor, Eos was a world of ice and shadow, a place where the sun was little more than a particularly bright star in a sky crowded with the distant glimmers of other galaxies. The transit was long and exceptionally quiet, the ship's hull occasionally popping and groaning as it adjusted to the extreme drop in ambient radiation. Aris Thorne spent much of this time in the engine room, performing deep cycle maintenance on the fusion core. He found the rhythmic thrum of the machinery to be a necessary anchor. In the absence of planetary color and atmospheric noise, the ship itself became their entire universe. Elara Vance turned her attention to the deep space telemetry, her interest piqued by a series of unusual thermal signatures emanating from the moon's southern pole. Eos was supposed to be a geologically dead rock, a frozen tomb of silicate and water ice, yet the sensors were picking up a faint, rhythmic pulse of heat that suggested something far more complex. She spent hours fine-tuning the long-range scanners, her brow furrowed in concentration. She did not use the aggressive, invasive probes of a mining corporation. She used the delicate, passive senses of a scholar, listening to the world rather than shouting at it. As they entered the moon's orbit, the visual feed revealed a landscape of breathtaking desolation. The surface was composed of jagged obsidian ridges and vast plains of frozen nitrogen that shimmered like spilled mercury under the weak starlight. There were no clouds, no winds, and no sound, only the terrible, beautiful majesty of a world perfectly preserved in a state of absolute zero. The descent to Eos was the most precise maneuver Aris had ever executed. Without an atmosphere to provide lift or friction, the ship relied entirely on its ventral thrusters to counter the moon's surprisingly dense gravity. He guided the craft toward a wide, flat basin near the southern pole, where the obsidian ground was smoothed into a dark, reflective mirror. The landing was feather-light, the struts making contact with a silent, jarring vibration that echoed through the frame of the ship. When the engines finally fell silent, the stillness that followed was heavy and profound. It was the silence of a place that had not heard a sound in a billion years. Aris sat in the cockpit for a long time, watching the stars reflected in the black ground beneath them. He felt like an intruder in a cathedral of ice, a brief and noisy spark in a place dedicated to the eternal dark. They prepared for the EVA with a level of care that bordered on the ritualistic. The temperatures outside were low enough to turn common metals brittle, requiring them to wear their heavy-duty thermal plating and specialized heating coils. When the airlock finally opened, the transition was physical. Even through the layers of the suit, Aris could feel the absolute absence of heat, a vacuum that seemed to pull at his very soul. He stepped onto the obsidian surface, his boots making a sharp, metallic ring against the frozen ground. He looked up and saw the primary star, now a small, pale disk that provided no warmth, only a cold, silver light that turned the shadows into pits of bottomless ink. He felt a sense of vertigo, the realization that he was standing on a tiny pebble at the edge of an infinite cliff. They began their trek toward the thermal anomaly, which lay at the center of a massive crater nicknamed the Eye of Eos. The walk was difficult, the terrain a maze of razor-sharp glass and treacherous drifts of frozen gas. As they reached the rim of the crater, they stopped, frozen by the sight that greeted them. At the center of the eye was a massive structure that was clearly not a natural formation. It was a forest of obsidian pillars, each hundreds of meters tall, arranged in a series of concentric circles that mirrored the structure of an atom. In the very center of the pillars sat a sphere of pure, unblemished white ice that glowed with a soft, internal light. This was the source of the thermal pulse, a slow, steady heartbeat of warmth that radiated from the sphere and kept the surrounding obsidian from fracturing in the cold. It was a cradle, a protected pocket of energy at the edge of the void. Elara moved toward the sphere, her senses clicking with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. She discovered that the white ice was not water, but a highly compressed form of metallic hydrogen, kept stable by the gravitational pressure of the obsidian pillars. It was an artificial sun, a microscopic star created by some ancient, unknown hand to act as a beacon or a life support system for something hidden within. She did not look for a door or a control panel. She simply sat at the base of the nearest pillar and placed her gloved hand against the stone. She felt the vibration of the pulse, a low-frequency hum that reminded her of the islands on Thalassa Minor, but deeper, more fundamental. It was the sound of a heart beating in the dark, a promise that even here, at the end of all things, life, or the potential for it, was being carefully guarded. Aris walked among the pillars, his flashlight casting long, dancing shadows against the black glass. He found symbols etched into the stone, geometric patterns that matched the weavings they had seen in the nebula. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The entire star system was a curated gallery, a series of experiments in beauty and complexity linked by a single, overarching intelligence. Whoever had built the loom in the nebula and the cradle on Eos had not done so out of a desire for power or territory. They had done it to see if they could make the universe sing. He sat down next to Elara, his back against the obsidian, and looked out at the horizon. From this vantage point, he could see the gas giant hanging in the sky, a massive, charcoal-colored orb that blocked out half the stars. He felt a strange sense of belonging, a realization that he and Elara were now part of the experiment. They were the ones who had finally come to see the work. The hours passed in a state of quiet contemplation. They did not need to talk about what the discovery meant for humanity or the future of space travel. Those were concerns for a different time and a different version of themselves. Here, in the shadow of the obsidian pillars, they were simply two observers witnessing the end of a very long story. The pulse of the cradle was soothing, a rhythmic reminder that the universe was not a cold, indifferent machine, but a place capable of infinite tenderness. Aris found himself drifting into a light sleep, his dreams filled with the emerald forests of Aurelia, the golden dunes of Solara, and the silver tides of Thalassa. All of it led here, to this quiet, black moon and the glowing sphere of white ice. It was a journey of integration, a path that had stripped away his restlessness and replaced it with a profound, unshakable peace. As the primary star began to dip below the horizon, plunging the crater into a deeper darkness, the obsidian pillars began to glow. They acted as conductors for the cradle's energy, light flowing through the stone in veins of soft violet and deep blue. The entire crater became a bowl of light, a sanctuary in the middle of the frozen waste. Aris and Elara stood up, their shadows stretching out like giants across the obsidian floor. They knew it was time to leave. Their air supplies were beginning to run low, and the Seeker of Horizons was waiting for them in the basin. They began the long walk back, their movements synchronized and certain. They did not look back, for the image of the cradle was burned into their minds, a permanent light to guide them through whatever darkness lay ahead. The climb back into the ship was a slow, mechanical process, but the interior of the vessel no longer felt like a sterile prison. It felt like a part of the cradle, a small, warm space carrying the memory of the stars. Aris took his place at the helm and began the departure sequence, his hands moving over the controls with a grace that felt like a dance. He lifted the ship from the obsidian surface, the blue flame of the thrusters, the only blemish on the moon's perfect, dark reflection. As they cleared the orbit of Eos and set the course for the long journey home, Aris looked at the telemetry one last time. The pulse was still there, a steady, rhythmic beat in the silence of the void. He turned off the long-range scanners, opting instead to fly by the light of the stars. He was no longer a navigator looking for a destination. He was a traveler who had already arrived. The Seeker of Horizons moved forward, a tiny silver speck against the vast tapestry of the universe, carrying two people who had seen the heart of the galaxy and found it was beating in time with their own. The return journey from the farthest reaches of the system was not a retreat, but a slow, contemplative progression through the memories of the worlds they had touched. Aris Thorne kept the Seeker of Horizons at a leisurely cruising speed, allowing the ship to drift through the interplanetary medium like a leaf on a still pond. The transition from the absolute stillness of Eos back toward the inner warmth of the system felt like a gradual reawakening of the senses. He spent many hours on the flight deck, his hands folded in his lap, watching the distant sun grow from a cold needlepoint into a warm, inviting hearth. The ship's interior, once a marvel of engineering to him, now seemed like a humble vessel carrying a sacred cargo, not of minerals or biological samples, but of a fundamental shift in perspective. He felt a strange lightness in his chest, a shedding of the ambition that had once driven him to seek the edges of the map. He had found the edge, and he had discovered that it was not a boundary, but a beginning. Elara Vance occupied herself with the final synthesis of their data, though she no longer felt the urgency to categorize or define. She sat in the laboratory, surrounded by holographic projections of emerald moss, amber towers, silver tides, and indigo clouds. She saw now that the data points were not separate entities, but parts of a singular, coherent narrative written by an intelligence that spoke in the language of physics and beauty. She spent her time crafting a legacy of the voyage that was more poetry than report, a record intended to inspire wonder rather than exploitation. She thought of the people back at the core stations, living in their steel boxes and dreaming of expansion, and she hoped that her words would act as a seed of quietude. She didn't want to bring back a map for others to follow. She wanted to bring back a reason to stop and listen to the universe's own heartbeat. As they passed the orbit of Thalassa Minor, the ship was bathed in the reflected silver light of the ocean world. Aris adjusted the sensors to catch the low-frequency hum of the archipelago one last time. The sound was fainter now, a ghost of a melody, but it resonated within the hull of the ship, a reminder of the interconnectedness of all things. He thought about the manta creatures and the glass willow trees, and he realized that they didn't need him to understand them. They existed in a perfect state of being, regardless of whether a human eye ever beheld them. This realization brought him a profound sense of relief. The universe was not a puzzle to be solved, it was an experience to be shared. He shared a quiet meal with Elara in the galley, the two of them watching the play of light on the bulkheads. They spoke of small things, the taste of the tea, the way the shadows moved, the comfort of the ship's hum. The grand revelations of their journey were now part of their foundation, no longer requiring constant discussion. The approach to the inner system brought them back toward Aurelia Prime, the first world they had visited. The planet looked like a glowing emerald set against the black velvet of space, its bioluminescence visible even from a distance. Aris felt a surge of affection for the world, a sense of returning to an old friend. He decided to take the ship into a high, stable orbit for one final night before they engaged the long-range jump drive for the journey back to the colonies. He wanted to sleep under the light of the green forest one more time. As the Seeker of Horizons settled into its orbital path, the ship's systems transitioned into a low-power mode, the internal lights dimming to match the soft glow of the planet below. Aris lay in his bunk, his eyes closed, and he could almost feel the springy violet moss beneath him and the scent of crushed mint in the air. He was at peace with the knowledge that he might never set foot on that soil again. The memory was as real as the physical world. In the final hours before the jump, Aris and Elara stood together on the observation deck. The system was laid out before them, a collection of masterpieces orbiting a gentle star. They saw the golden spark of Solara Secundus, the indigo veil of the Weaver's Wake, and the dark, distant point of Eos. It was a gallery of the infinite, a reminder that the universe was a place of endless creativity and profound kindness. Aris reached out and touched the viewport, the glass cool against his fingertips. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the Seeker of Horizons, the sturdy little craft that had carried them through the wonders and the terrors of the deep. It was more than a machine, it was a witness. He looked at Elara and saw the same quiet radiance in her eyes. They were different people than the ones who had left the station months ago. They had been hollowed out by the vastness and filled back up with the light of the stars. Aris returned to the pilot's chair and began the final sequence for the fold space jump. His movements were precise and fluid, a culmination of years of training and the newfound clarity of his journey. He didn't feel the usual anxiety associated with the jump, the fear of the unknown, or the pressure of the destination. He felt like he was simply stepping from one room of a grand house into another. He engaged the primary stabilizers and watched as the gravitational lattice of the system began to warp around the ship. The emerald sphere of Aurelia Prime blurred, its colors stretching into long, shimmering ribbons of light. For a moment, the ship existed in the space between spaces, a place of pure potential where time and distance had no meaning. In that moment, Aris felt the presence of all the worlds they had visited, the green, the gold, the silver, and the black, all merging into a single, blinding point of white peace. When the ship finally re-emerged into the familiar space of the core colonies, the transition was jarring. The sky was crowded with the lights of distant stations and the frantic traffic of commerce. The silence of the void was replaced by the constant chatter of the long-range comms, a cacophony of voices seeking data, permission, and profit. Aris ignored the incoming signals for a few minutes, allowing the ship to drift in the quiet pocket of the jump exit. He looked at the sensor arrays, which were already being flooded with requests for their logs and findings. He knew that their arrival would spark a flurry of activity, a rush to analyze and exploit the secrets they carried. But he also knew that he and Elara held the true treasure, something that could not be downloaded or sold. They held the memory of the light, the resonance of the islands, and the heartbeat of the obsidian cradle. Elara joined him at the helm, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She looked at the crowded space of the colonies and then back at the dark path they had traveled. She didn't say a word, but Aris understood her perfectly. They were the keepers of a secret flame, a small spark of wonder in a world that had forgotten how to look up. They would deliver their reports, they would share their findings, but they would do so in a way that protected the sanctity of what they had seen. They would be the ambassadors of the quiet, the advocates for the worlds that did not want to be found. As the Seeker of Horizons began its final approach toward the primary docking hub, Aris felt a sense of completion that was as deep as the ocean of Thalassa. He had gone to the edge of the world and found that the world had no edge. The ship docked with a soft, mechanical click, the umbilical cord of the station connecting them back to the reality of their species. The airlock cycled open, and the smells of recycled air and industrial grease wafted into the cabin. Aris stood up, his legs feeling heavy in the station's artificial gravity. He took one last look around the cockpit, the home that had been his universe for so long. He saw the notebook where he had sketched the creatures of Aurelia, the small jar of amber dust on Elara's desk, and the way the light of the station's sun reflected off the silver hull. He felt a pang of nostalgia, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of purpose. He walked toward the hatch, Elara by his side, ready to step back into the world of men. He knew that the journey was not over, it was simply changing form. As they stepped onto the station's concourse, the noise and the light of the city surrounded them. People rushed past, their eyes fixed on their handheld devices, their minds occupied with the trivialities of the day. Aris and Elara walked with a different pace, a slow and rhythmic gait that seemed to exist in a different time zone. They were like two drops of clear water in a muddy stream. They knew that they would eventually be asked to lead more expeditions, to find more worlds, and to push the boundaries of the known even further. And they would go, not out of a desire for discovery, but out of a love for the journey itself. For they had learned the greatest lesson of the stars, that the horizon is not a place you reach, but a way of looking at the world. The seeker of horizons would fly again, and the universe would continue to sing, and Aris Thorne would always be listening.